So here we are on the Nile on this beautiful boat. We've just passed a place called Elephantine Island, and it's because some of the rocks on that particular island look like elephants. There's one of the temples, of course, to one of the main gods, the god of the sun, and that was the place where Aswan used to be. And we can see the natural part of the Nile here. Some of the birds, and you can see the rocks and all of the different types of creatures that live on the Nile. And this is where we could picture Moses' mother would have come down with that basket on that day when she wanted to keep him and to save his life. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we go toward the shore. We find ourselves here on the edge of the Nile. We have these typical plants that you always associate with the Nile, the papyrus and all these beautiful water plants. There's a lot of gorgeous birds. And this is our scene to really go into who Moses is. He is the person that we're walking with during this pilgrimage. He'll be taking us through this entire path of the commandments of the Lord. And it would be important to remember how it was that he was born. Remember, the people, the Hebrews, that word actually means foreigner, they never forgot their origins. Israel, one of his youngest sons, Joseph, is the one that came down here to Egypt. And so Joseph, when he was alive, everyone in Egypt had great respect for the people because he, of course, maintained the life of the Egyptians and also the foreign people around here. But when he died, they forgot about him, and that's when, of course, as we spoke about just recently, they became more and more oppressed by slavery. In fact, it became so bad that it says in Exodus chapter 1, verse 15, that they wanted to start getting rid of the Hebrew people, the Israelites. So it says here, "Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives," one of them was named Siphrah, the other one named Porah, "When you serve as a midwife to the Hebrew women and see them upon the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him, but if it is a daughter, she shall live." But listen to what it says right here. These are women who understand in a certain way, just because they're women, certainly, but also because being part of the chosen people, the Lord was protecting them and bringing them to the point where, very different than the pagan culture in which they were inserted, they understood and feared God. It says actually here in verse 17, "The midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live." So the king wasn't too happy about this. He actually asked them in the next verse, "Why have you done this and let the male children live?" And this is what they said. "The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, they're strong, right? The boys, they give birth before we can actually get there. But this is what it says in verse 20. God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. Because the midwives feared God, he gave them families." So the Lord is actually speaking to them in their conscience. It's this voice that we have inside. You know, as Christians, we understand that it's the Holy Spirit himself, which is inside of us. But this is also the natural law. We're going to be talking about the law that God gives us on Mount Sinai. We're going to go deeper into the fulfillment of that law in the Beatitudes. But this is the basic law that every human person has, that natural law inside. So then what happens at the time when Moses is born? He comes from the house of Levi. Remember that Israel, he had 12 sons, and one of those sons being Joseph. Okay, so he had all of his kids. But the 12 tribes all came down to survive in the land of Egypt because they were starving. And so the house of Levi from the house of Levi, both the mother and the father of Moses came. And so this is what happened when he was born. This is in chapter 2 of Exodus. "A man from the house of Levi went and took to wife a daughter of Levi. The woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a goodly child, She hid him 3 months, and when she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made from bulrushes, and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. And she put the child in it, and placed it among the reeds at the river's bank. And his sisters stood at a distance. So this was a woman, knowing that there was still this whole command that the boy should be killed, was desperate to save her son. And it's just a very interesting thing to me to think that to save him, she would put him in the water. You know, we can't help, as you know, we read, as we talked about at the beginning, when we read the Old Testament, it is fulfilled in the New. And the New is enlightened by the Old. That's what St. Augustine says. And if you think about this, she saves him by putting him in the water. His name means being drawn from the water. It brings us to our baptism. We are saved when we're put into the water and drawn out. So his sister was watching from a distance. We all know this story. She wanted to know what would be done with the boy. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came to bathe in the river, and her maidens walked beside the river, and she saw the basket among the reeds, and set her maid to fetch it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrew children." Then his sister said to the Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." And the girl went and called the child's own mother. The Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him, and the child grew. And she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses, for she said, "I drew him out of the water." So you can imagine, in a place as beautiful as this, on these rocks, a little bit more private, Pharaoh's daughter would have come and would have bathed and would have found this child in this basket. This is all woven into the history of salvation. And we can never forget that Moses is one of the most important figures for the Israelite people. He is the one who is a prefigurement of who Jesus is himself. And we're going to talk more about that. And for now, let's enjoy looking at this beautiful Nile River. And in a moment, we're going to talk a little bit more about what Moses does once he grows and speaks to the Pharaoh about this river and about his people. Up from the edge of the Nile, here a little bit of what you could call inland from the water, and we're right on a very large lake. In ancient times, it was a lake called Maurice. It's an important area because here many of the pharaohs decided to build their palaces. And so when Moses was taken from the water, it was probably in this area where he grew up as the son of the princess. Where can we find it on our map? Well, you can see very easily the Nile Delta here at the top. And if you make your way south with your eyes right here, you'll see a word that says Fayum. And this is where we are sitting right now. You see there's a long canal here and a lake right here to the top. And this served a very important purpose. In fact, it was well back in, more than 4,000 years ago, in about 2300 BC, that this canal was first built to connect to the Nile River. And the reason they did that was to control flooding, because of course the Nile would flood every single year. But then there were times when there was drought. And so this lake actually served as sort of like a water reservoir that they could use to be able to access water in those times of need. And then also this maintained this whole area, especially up in here, sort of like a natural oasis. It's not a natural oasis, but it seemed like it. But it was always well watered, had a lot of agricultural and a lot of growth in that area. And so it was a perfect place to live and to grow up. In fact, it was always a perfect temperature. You didn't have all these temperature switches. You didn't have too much wind like we do today. And so this is why the pharaohs lived there. If you want to ask yourself how far it is from Cairo, well now you can make it in a couple of hours. It's about 50 miles away. And so you can also imagine in your mind's eye how the Hebrew people up in the north would come down and maybe build for Pharaoh, go all the way down toward the southern part of the Nile and build a lot of the temples and storehouses. But it would be easy for a messenger to go back and forth between Pharaoh and the people from the delta to Fayum. And so it just kind of helps us to understand where Moses lived. Now, growing up here in the palace of the Pharaoh with the princess as your mother, you can imagine how steeped he was in everything that had to do with Egyptian culture. In the temples, there were the great astronomers, there was great medicine, there was great knowledge of civilizations, there was an understanding of all the different peoples that lived in the area, techniques of war. Moses grew up as a warrior, and this is extremely important if you think about what the role is he will take up when the people leave the land of Egypt. And so he had all of this knowledge. Now, since we saw where he was born and where he was taken up, I wanted to mention what happens after he grows up. And he grows up again in the house, probably, most academics agree, but there's a lot of debate there, and it's just an interesting debate. No one can say for sure, but he probably grew up in the house of Ramses II. And Ramses was one of the most important pharaohs ever. In fact, he conquered so many people. He went up, even up into what we would call modern-day Syria, and conquered the Hittites. This is actually unknown in the ancient world. And you can see that in something that Moses learned. He not only learned, of course, how to read the hieroglyphics, but he was an expert storyteller. This, again, is so important for the man to whom the Pentateuch is attributed, the one who told the story of Exodus and the foundation of the people of Israel afterwards. One of my favorite hieroglyphics is actually down toward the south, much further south than where the pharaohs lived and where he grew up. And that shows the story of when the pharaoh conquered all of these people. You've got the hieroglyphic with the enemies with their hands behind their backs. You have another hieroglyphic of all of the enemies turned slaves with their hands tied. And you even have in a different part of the temple where they show the offerings of libations or offerings of flowers or oil or whatever, wine. They show the offerings of people kind of strung up that are going to be offered to the gods who conquered. So this is Moses' mentality. Greatness, grandeur, conquering, warrior. And so what happens when he grows up? He begins to sense something inside. And you can read about that if you go to Exodus chapter 2, right after he's taken up from the water. It skips a number of years and talks about him when he grows up. In fact, it says in verse 11 of chapter 2, one day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked upon their burdens. Because with all of this, you might ask yourself, I asked myself, would he remember where he came from? Would he know that he's a Levite? Would he know his traditions? Would he know about his own religion? Well, it shows very clearly in Exodus that he did, because he knew who his people were, and he looked upon their burdens. And I could read the part of Exodus, but I want to instead read the same story that's actually told by the deacon Stephen. Remember, Stephen was the very first martyr of the church after Jesus rose from the dead. And it's because he was giving testimony of how the Lord Jesus fulfilled all of the prophecies. In fact, in this testimony, he is saying in the Acts of the Apostles that Jesus is the new Moses. And we'll talk about that a little further in our pilgrimage. But if you go to Acts chapter 7, you can read all about Stephen's testimony. And if you go to verse 23, he begins to speak about Moses, who when he was 40 years old, this is what he says, it came into his heart to visit his brethren. Something was coming into his heart. A voice was speaking to him. The Lord was beginning his work personally with Moses. And so it continues, seeing one of them being wronged, he defended the oppressed man and avenged him by striking the Egyptian. Now listen to this part of how Stephen says it. He supposed that his brethren understood that God was giving them deliverance by his hand, but they did not understand. This shows that God is working deep inside. It also shows the difficulties he's going to have as a leader of his people. But even more than that, It shows the process or the journey of this entire pilgrimage, not just for Moses, but that's the first pilgrimage, how he needs to make a journey of understanding how to listen to God's voice, understanding how to hear his conscience, and then help the entire people of Israel to do the same. Further on, Stephen says, as we know the story, once the Hebrew saw the Egyptian killed, he goes and he finds two Hebrews fighting with one another, and Stephen says, men, you are brethren. Why do you wrong each other? Speaking about what happened to Moses. But the man who was wronging his neighbor thrust him aside, saying, who made you a ruler and judge over us? Do you want to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday? At this retort, Moses fled and became an exile in the land of Midian. We'll talk about that in just a moment. So this is Moses struggling to understand what's going on in his heart. And this is kind of the second phase of his life. And when you think about Moses, the great lawgiver, and what's going to happen on Mount Sinai that we know very well, it leads us to a very important point if we're going to understand the Decalogue, and that's the moral conscience. So what is it that we know about the moral conscience? Well, the conscience is simply a judgment of the reason about what is right and what is wrong in human action. It's God speaking inside of Moses. It has three functions. It enjoins him, or it enjoins each one of us at the appropriate moment to do good and to avoid evil. Striking the Egyptian, burying him in the sand, is that good? Abraham sacrificing his own son Isaac, is that good? There needs to be a clarity of conscience, a clarity of the voice of God. And the reason that happens, you think about Moses when he's here in Egypt, there's a lot of things that are mixed in. But God is trying to say, you are my chosen people. I want you to listen to my voice. So it enjoins him to act at the appropriate time. It also judges particular choices, approving those that are good and denouncing those that are evil. And it bears witness to the authority of truth in reference to the supreme good, who is God himself. So the most important thing, however, is when a person listens to his conscience, when we try to follow our conscience like Moses was doing, the prudent man can hear God speaking. This is what the Lord wanted to show Moses, so that in turn, Moses could show the people. Now, the dignity of the human person is important in this sense. The conscience is key to that. And this is the diversity or the difference between the Israelite people and the Egyptians. The dignity of the human person implies and requires uprightness of moral conscience. So let's talk about what that means. First of all, it's the perception of the principles of morality. Those are almost like spelled out in the future in the Decalogue, we'll see. And secondly, it's their application in given circumstances. Thirdly, it's the judgment about concrete acts yet to be performed or have already been performed. So it acts as a judge. It helps us to do something which is really important, and that is to come before the Lord and say, you know what? There is something that goes beyond me. And I need to come before you and ask for forgiveness and ask for mercy. So in this, our conscience gives us hope. It's a certainty of hope. And this is a lesson that not only Moses, but the whole people who are being freed or will be freed need to learn. It's not these great conquests of Egypt that will free you. It's not striking the Egyptian. It's not by power and war. It is actually by God's hand that they will be freed. Now, at the very end of the passage, both in Exodus and here in what Stephen is telling the great council in Jerusalem, and he's being judged, it means that you need time to listen. It's important for every person to be, listen to this phrase, sufficiently present to himself. When we are surrounded by so many things and so many activities and really distractions, or just thinking of ourselves or just surviving, it's very difficult to be completely present to ourselves. We need what they call interiority. Moses fled, it says. Moses fled. He left. He went to the desert. In the desert, there's nothing. There's nothing to distract. So that's a place of interiority. So we can take these words that I'm going to tell you of St. Augustine as our guide as we continue this pilgrimage. And let's move on to the next step of Moses' life. And this is what St. Augustine says: return to your conscience, question it, turn inward, brethren, and in everything you do, see God as your witness. This is our conscience, and this is what Moses is learning. So let's go to the next phase of his call from God, and we will see each other in our next stop, which is in the land of Midian, where Moses receives his call from the Lord. Follow me.